Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Pentecost with APA Virginia staff. Thank you for joining us for our monthly webinar series, Your Hour with APA, sponsored by the Berkeley Group. Thank you for sticking with us the past couple months while we took a little summer hiatus from our webinar series. So we're excited to jump right back in now that fall is in the air and highlight some of the great planning going on in Virginia and some of our sponsors. If you tune in next month for October's webinar on October 22nd, we've got Michael Baker International presenting on some work they've been doing here in Virginia. And we are very grateful for their support of the chapter. They're one of our annual sponsors and conference sponsors. So be on the lookout for the follow-up email to this webinar. It will have all of the CM credit info for this one and how to sign up for next month's webinar. Before we get started, I will give a few chapter updates. So you know, we had our conference back in July at Wintergreen Resort. That was really fun for everyone that was not there. You didn't miss the rain. Save the date for next year, next year at Hampton, July 21st through 24th. We'll be at the Convention Center. So be on the lookout. More info will start coming out about that in the next few months, as well as an RFP. If you're interested in presenting at our annual conference, be on the lookout for that coming at the end of the year. Congratulations to our newly elected board members. As some of you may have seen in the newsletter that went out on Friday, we have some returning leadership positions like our president, Earl Anderson, and we have some new faces as well. So we're really excited to welcome them on October 5th. We'll have our board meeting and retreat here in Richmond, Virginia. And board meetings are open to all members of the chapter. You don't have to be a board member. You're always welcome to come and sit in on the meetings if you just want to learn more about APA Virginia, what the chapter does, or how to get involved later on, or if you'd like to volunteer for a committee, maybe even the conference planning committee. You're always welcome. So again, that's October 5th. The meeting will be from about 9 to 5. So if you're interested in attending, just get in touch with one of us. Get in touch with myself or Martina James or Eldon James, and we'll get you squared away. There's also a couple other things coming up: an AICP exam prep session October 13th in College Park, Maryland. It's not in Virginia, but it's close by. So for those of you looking to get your AICP certification, you might want to look into that. You can find that on planning.org on the CM search log. Alrighty, for those who just signed on, thank you for joining us for our monthly webinar series, Your Hour with APA Virginia, sponsored by the Berkeley Group. And thank you to everyone who shares this with your colleagues and coworkers and helps spread the word. We've grown a lot over the past year, so I'm really happy to see high attendance numbers today. These are the fourth Monday of each month from noon to 1 p.m., covering many topics in the planning field. And CM credit, one CM credit is always available for those of you watching it live. If you're watching a recording of this, you can't get a CM credit. But you can find this on YouTube and within 24 hours. All right. So for today, we are doing this webinar in partnership with Island Press. Very thankful for their partnership. Today we're highlighting a new book, Resilience for All, Striving for Equity Through Community-Driven Design. And joining us today is the author, Barbara Brown Wilson. She is also an assistant professor of urban and environmental planning at the University of Virginia School of Architecture. So we're very excited to have her with us today, as well as two of her colleagues with the Piedmont Housing Alliance, also in Charlottesville. Sunshine Mathon is the executive director, and Claudette Grant, she is a community organizer with Piedmont Housing Alliance. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to them.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here and with two of my very favorite colleagues here in Charlottesville. I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the book and the sort of main tenets to frame the conversation, but then I wanted to pass it over to Sunshine and Claudette, because I think many of you are probably excited to hear about this really phenomenal project, which I really think is one of the best manifestations of community-driven design happening in the country, not just in the state of Virginia. So really pleased to have that my book be a part of that discussion today. So I came at this topic partially out of let's see if I can move my slides successfully.
No, sorry, just a second.
Okay. Sunshine, Claudette, and I are together, so this is good because we can figure this out as a team. Okay, great. Partially, with extreme weather events, there we go, coming more, more commonly across the globe, and this understanding from the environmental justice movement that actually there's a disproportionate impact of all sorts of environmental injustice to socioeconomically vulnerable communities who are also often put in the more ecologically vulnerable parts of our land use plans and patterns, and really trying to think about the ways in which communities affected by land use decisions can be not only at the table, but driving the decisions that are going to affect their lives. And so I was trying to place this within those sort of larger fields of social impact, public interest design word soup, and did a survey of many hundred practitioners and asked them to place all of this language on a continuum as they understood it between professional-driven, sort of technically driven design work and community-driven design work, and then also on a continuum between sort of product-oriented work and capacity-oriented work, because many of these neighborhoods are responding to urban stressors that relate to or end up producing gentrification, and involuntary displacement means that the product-oriented version will not prevent that, right? Whereas a capacities-oriented version of design allows people to stay no matter what urban stressors might come their way. And what you'll find, or what we found as we looked also at the language people are using, not only in sort of literature, but also just in practice and on websites and everything else, can be sort of grouped in three buckets. So accessible design work is often accessible because it's lower cost. Either it's sort of guerrilla art making, creative placemaking work that's meant to be sort of do-it-yourself urbanism, or it's pro bono. So same approach to the design process, but doing it as a free service for communities at large. And I'll problematize that a bit further later, especially in terms of the tactical urbanist DIY work and its applicability in vulnerable communities. But moving up our chart here, there's also a large portion of the work that many of us probably think we do is in this responsible category, where we're talking largely about a public interest that is the thing reflected in our code of ethics for the profession. So it's not necessarily considering the disproportionate impacts on vulnerable communities and how to treat them appropriately to make sure that that they are able to stay in despite any urban stressor. And so I have been really interested in what is in the upper right-hand portion of this graphic, which are these types of community-driven and justice-oriented work, really coming out of the civil rights movement, but going beyond participatory design simply, which is more about inclusive processes, and also really focusing on equitable outcomes. So not only being at the table, but setting the agenda and defining the criteria for success and having the power to, to hold other decision makers accountable. So what does that work look like? How is it different? And what does that, what are lessons that the field of planning can take from this and incorporate into better practice in and with vulnerable communities? And just as I mentioned earlier, there is an over-policing issue that you need to think about when you say, oh, well, guerrilla urbanism absolutely works. Like any community can create a parklet or, a yarn bomb or some other, piece of artwork that allows you as citizens and as residents to contribute to the dialogue happening about what should be in urban space and, better blocks and the like. But there's actually been a fair amount of over-policing that happens when low-income communities of color try to do their own guerrilla urbanism, and so it really isn't an effective strategy, as the Washington Post, took on, I think, in 2017. And so I tried to look at what is effective and these best practices that are happening across the country, where communities are centering their own work, they're making their own decisions. These are socio-economically vulnerable communities, but that are typically also vulnerable to many, but at least one, extreme urban stressor. So the ones in bold, I did very deep case studies of where I was talking to residents and practitioners, and the largest network that I could find that would talk about their work in the project. And then the lighter case studies are vignettes along the way to prove that this is really happening all sorts of places and with very different techniques. But part of the work is thinking differently about the framing early on and on the practitioner side. And I'm happy to talk more about these later if anyone would like, but I want to make sure we get to the really exciting work happening in Virginia. So I'll just move on to say, one of the things that I took on, and the only color graphics in the book are actually these actor network maps that I made because I wanted to illustrate that the work is always very place-based, very much about these social networks, not only the strong ties, but also the weak ties between different types of groups, and who is at the center of these networks matters. And so who is making decisions, who is framing the work, whose knowledge is valued, absolutely changes the way the work looks. And these four main case studies happen in really different ways, and that's part of what I'm trying to get across, is that there is no one size fits all to any of this, and it's more about coalition building. And so just as I hand over the mic to talk about Virginia specific projects that I really think the work happening at Friendship Court is absolutely the best work in the country along these lines, especially as it relates to housing redevelopment, which is incredibly technically, complicated. But just quickly to summarize these lessons, as we were talking earlier, and it does seem like they're reflected in this project at large. There is an intractable relationship, as environmental justice has told us, between social issues and ecological issues. So treating one in its own sort of vacuum is just a tremendous loss, not only for the place, but also for our field. And I know many of you believe in this, but it's also a good reminder for other types of practitioners that are involved in the built world. Valuing the contributions of all parties is not just at the decision-making table. You can be heard and still not have any power in decision-making processes, but it's also from a monetary perspective. If you are not valuing the contributions of your resident leaders, it is much harder for them to come to the table and contribute, and so you end up with empty community meetings. You end up with a sort of lack of community interest, whereas some of these projects, I was amazed by the depth and the commitment to leadership development that allowed people to build the capacity they needed to come and be at the table for the entire process, because if you're having a Saturday afternoon event and all of the middle-class white people are paid for their time, but the people, of color that are lower income living in this community are all asking to volunteer, you end up, not surprisingly, with lower rates of participation. And then citizen science seems to be a really powerful mechanism for flipping the power dynamics. If I do a lot of this work at the University of Virginia, and it seems like when you ask, questions as a researcher and not as a resident researcher, they're fundamentally different. And then the data collected is different and the analysis is different. And so, especially when we're working in vulnerable communities, it feels critical to make sure that you have developed robust enough coalitions, to speak to the next lesson, that the people asking those questions, collecting the data, and figuring out what to do with the analysis need to be residents living in that neighborhood. In terms of lesson 5, inciting material play, this feels silly at times to have crafts at the table, but the work of collective building and doing and art making has been a way in these cases to get past trauma that's sometimes been, maybe get past might be the wrong phrase, but to collectively process trauma and make a place for it as a part of the decision-making process, but also to think about the future in ways that are more productive, because, regardless of your linguistic barriers or other barriers, there are ways that you can make things collectively that help you build community and build a sort of shared knowledge. Lesson 6 is really about community policing. I was, as unaware as I would like to admit that that the effectiveness of community policing, but there is enough research out there that really confirms that that community policing is always more effective, or at least as effective, if not more effective, than more sort of top-down strategies. So in working in vulnerable communities, any opportunity, if their crime is an issue, any opportunity to have your project contribute to a community policing ethic is a really wonderful one. And then even projects at the micro scale that are small, that are really maybe low budget, can inspire macro change. The work of restoring the Bayou Auguste project in East Biloxi was just one bayou. They called it the Bayou, and they were able to engage elementary school children and high school children and a lot of really wonderful schools nearby and citizen science activity. They were able to make it work with a local jobs coordinator to create a job training program and build a sort of test bed for what economic contributions a project that is all about bayou restoration can give to a lower income community. And now the city of Biloxi has taken this on as their project, and they've really championed it as one of their own. And instead of just one bayou being restored, which will not have a great effect on the sort of coastal resilience of the community, now they have 12 bayous being restored with people trained through that program, hired, and citizen science happening at every level. So even the small project can have huge effects, especially when you position it that way. So with all that said, I am excited to hand over the slide changer to Sunshine and Claudette.
Hello, everyone. This is Sunshine Mathon. We're going to be talking about Friendship Court here in Charlottesville, and Claudette will start us off there shortly, but I wanted to give just a quick overview of Piedmont Housing Alliance. And Piedmont Housing has been a part of the Charlottesville region for the last 35 years. And through though the specific roles the organization has played in the region have evolved over time, it has stayed true to its mission of creating housing opportunities and fostering community through financial education, lending, and equitable development. And Friendship Court, in many ways, symbolizes all of those things coming together in one place, as we'll talk about further along. So with that, Claudette's going to start us off talking a bit about the history.
Thank you, Sunshine. As Barbara has mentioned in her book, Charlottesville is not unlike any of the communities in her case studies in the book. Charlottesville, not unlike many cities in our country, in the 1960s, many cities began to think about urban renewal and redeveloping areas that were said to be substandard. In Charlottesville, the controversial redevelopment of Vinegar Hill, a neighborhood where African American families lived and worked, is the thorn in the side that still lives fresh in the memories of many in the African American community. The city hoped to expand the downtown business district, change traffic patterns, and provide housing for those who would be displaced from the redevelopment of their community. But as a result, replacement of low-income subsidized housing in Charlottesville was met with a lot of tension and controversy. And after the demolition of Vinegar Hill, the vacant land sat for 20 years before anything was rebuilt. In 1978, Garrett Square, now known as Friendship Court, was built to provide additional low-income subsidized housing. In 2001, the original owner decided to sell the property in order to preserve a subset of affordable housing in Charlottesville. The National Housing Trust Enterprise, located in Washington, D.C., in partnership with Piedmont Housing Alliance, the local presence of the partnership, purchased and renovated Friendship Court in 2002. Friendship Court had not experienced a major redevelopment in 40 years. So Piedmont Housing Alliance decided it was time for a major redevelopment. After much thought and research, in 2015, Piedmont Housing Alliance, in collaboration with the National Housing Trust Enterprise and a nationally recognized team of designers, planners, and affordable development experts, started working on a master planning process for the redevelopment of Friendship Court. Piedmont Housing Alliance decided to hire a community organizer whose office is located at Friendship Court. And I serve as a presence and connection between the residents and Piedmont Housing Alliance. One of my first tasks on the job was to hold an election where the residents would elect among themselves residents to serve on an advisory committee. We learned from a few other organizations around the country that having a group of residents who we could go to for feedback and connections with the community would be a great way for resident engagement and empowerment during the redevelopment process. So we had an election, and 10 residents were nominated for 7 seats. We gave minimal gift cards to those residents who voted in order to get people to come out and participate. Our top vote getter was a high school student who got all her friends and relatives to come out and vote for her. We now have 9 resident representatives, 2 of whom are youth in high school, and 6 non-residents who represent various areas of expertise. We have a city councilor who is an architect, a former Friendship Court resident and resident leader, the interim city manager, a former nurse, an architect who happened to work on the 2002 renovation of Friendship Court, and a representative from the National Housing Trust Enterprise. The advisory committee meets monthly, and depending on what decisions need to be made, sometimes we meet twice a month. The residents are paid for their time because we feel it is important that they know we value the time and service they are spending to work on the redevelopment. Besides meetings, we have engaged in a variety of activities, such as touring similar housing sites in Washington, D.C., to see what we hope to redevelop. We have also looked at early childhood centers, which we are planning to add to the site. All of these activities help to inform the committee to make better decisions. There have also been many community meetings as we have worked through the master plan and redevelopment processes. As I end this portion of our discussion, I want to point out that all of this takes time, and there are going to be ups and downs to work through. One of the most pivotal activities that really brought the advisory committee to cohesion was when they got to interview and choose the architects for the first phase of the project. The sense of being a part of the process in decision-making gave the residents a sense of ownership and buy-in to their future. This is something many of them had not experienced before. And this is a photo or a slide of the master plan as we sort of left it off. And I'll turn it over to Sunshine to go from there.
So the master plan rendering that's here is from essentially the end of 2016, which marked a process of engagement over a year and a half. But I'm gonna step back for a moment and just quickly discuss, why do we need to redevelop? And all of these fundamentally root from concerns and ideas from the residents. So the need for ladder affordability relates to the fact that for many people who live in Friendship Court over the years, the last 40 years, for some of them, they've been able to use Friendship Court as a platform and a safety net when a financial crisis hit or an issue in their family became evident, and they needed a place to come to stabilize and then move on. And for some families where maybe perhaps they're dependent on fixed incomes, such as Social Security income or disability, they might be there for the long haul. But for many families, they get stuck at Friendship Court. And that's in part due to the fact that it is incredibly difficult to break out of the cycle of poverty in anywhere in the country, but in particular in Charlottesville. Charlottesville has one of the lowest opportunity rates for folks to break out of that cycle of poverty. But further, if someone did stabilize their income and stabilize their family, the lack of moderate and lower income housing in the region itself meant that when they were ready to move on, where could they move to? There were very, very few options. So needing that built-in ladder of affordability inside of Friendship Court was identified as a primary need. Historically, the property was built in the 1970s as basically a mega block, almost like a giant cul-de-sac community in the heart of, the downtown mall is 2 blocks to the north. You have single-family neighborhoods to the east and somewhat to the west. You have a somewhat commercial district to the west as well. Friendship Court has kind of stayed isolated, and the residents have stayed economically isolated from the surrounding community over those 40 years. So the idea of being able to knit the city back together again to the benefit of the residents is one of the key goals too. More than just building housing, as we go through the redevelopment, we will absolutely be looking through the lens of opportunities for folks to build wealth in their families, to get better jobs, to get job training, whether that's related directly to construction or other measures that we will continue to pursue as development ensues. The buildings, even though, obviously there are many buildings out there that are old and magnificent on their own and were well built in the first place, The buildings at Friendship Court were built 40 years ago, and they're starting to reach their end of life. They were not that well designed in the beginning, and they're ready to be replaced. And then one thing I hear consistently from residents, particularly the youth, is that when you have an address at Garrett Square, everyone knows where you live, and there's a stigma that comes with that. So the idea of redeveloping Friendship Court to start to erode that stigma is critical. As I mentioned earlier, and as many of you probably know, Charlottesville, like much of Virginia and much of the rest of the country, is in an affordable housing crisis. And as we redevelop, we'll be adding additional units of affordable housing, and that's part of what the redevelopment needs to do, is to add that affordable housing stock. I'm going to move forward a little bit more quickly to make sure we catch up on time here. So in 2016, this was the master plan that was developed out of the initial outreach process. Then basically through 2017, there was a process of going to the community in the Friendship Court, but also the surrounding community as well, the city as a whole, to get feedback and to see if that planning process had gotten it right. And there are a few major points that emerged as critical concerns that we then needed to use as a refinement process for the redevelopment. So one of the initial concerns, well, actually before that, one of the things that got right, and you can't quite see it here, but you can see that there are multiple phases planned. The beauty of the phasing process is that it allows us to develop in a portion of the site first, where we do a build first type of process, where we build housing, and then a portion of the residents from phase one will move into that housing, and then we'll tear down the now empty housing, build phase two, and then another portion of residents will move into those units. And I'll make that process clear as we move further along in the slides. So from that perspective, the decision to do a phasing process is absolutely the right decision, and because it makes absolutely sure that there's zero displacement through this process, and that the residents are maintained as a central focus throughout all of this. The struggle, though, was that it was proposed to be a 7-phase process. And that meant 12 to 14 years of potentially living in a construction zone if you're a resident, and just having that level of disruption that entire time. And for folks who lived in the later phases, that meant that they would have to wait for potentially over a decade before they got new homes. That's a long time. And then further, there was early on identified another successful piece, which is that the residents wanted a high quality early childhood center, but it was identified to be in phase 7. That was a major concern for folks, because that meant, again, that would be out 12 to 14 years. Another big concern is that the preliminary master plan showed only multifamily apartment style building typologies. And right now, the residents live predominantly in townhome configurations. And many of the families, in particular, families with children, very much prefer that housing typology. They like the feeling of being able to open their front door either onto green space or onto a sidewalk, and have their kids run in and out easily. From a safety perspective, being able to call their kids in quickly if need arises. So there is a sense that only having multifamily apartment style buildings didn't really truly address the community desires. And then as part of the redevelopment, the proposal is to add a significant number of units. And you'll see on the left is the 150 Section 8 units. So that's the existing community. It's 150 apartments now for 150 families. The goal by the end of the initial phasing plan was to add an additional 75 to 80 additional affordable units, and then 370 market rate units. There are a couple of concerns on this front. One is that going from 150 to ultimately 600 units on the site felt like a pretty enormous jump for a lot of the community, just in terms of just the density in the community. And then secondarily, the addition of the market rate at that level felt, if not, the residents are not going to be physically displaced in the community, because everyone's going to, the phasing process allows for zero displacement. but the addition of 370 market rate units for many folks felt like there was a risk of social displacement, that what they considered their community was going to be transformed so dramatically that it wouldn't feel like home anymore. And then as we were wrapping up that listening process, August 11th and 12th of 2017 happened. And for lots of reasons, that was incredibly traumatic and difficult for the community as a whole. One of the silver linings that emerged in the months after that event, though, is that it brought the affordable housing crisis up to the level of everyone was talking about it, and in particular talking about it in the context as if we can address our affordable housing crisis as a city, it begins to potentially address the history of social inequity and racial injustice in the community. So in the context of that shifts how we look at our city historically and how we look at our city as a future, and that's true at Friendship Court as well. So as Claudette referred to, we have the advisory committee that was established over 2 years ago was one of the most critically successful components of the planning process at the beginning. The advisory committee, with the residents as its core focus, have been the primary conduit by which we engage the residents on a regular basis. So the fact that they are elected by their community and have a mandate from the residents as a whole to represent them through this process allows us to have these regular meetings and to dive deeply into the design process, working with them and building their capacity to engage with at the level of experts in the planning process has been absolutely enormously beneficial, not only for the design team as a whole, and the design team absolutely includes the advisory committee, but beneficial for the residents as well in terms of their leadership development and their, as Claudette mentioned before, their sense of ownership over their future. So we took, starting in roughly September, October last year, we took those concerns that I referred to a moment ago, all of these here, and there were others as well, but those are the big overarching ones. We took those concerns and started to pull apart that initial plan to try to see how we could begin to address those concerns. And interestingly, the concerns as a whole, they in many ways are actually all interlinked. So as soon as we started to talk about, well, how do we get some townhomes in the site? Well, that starts to address the number of total units that are possible in the redevelopment. And then that also starts to address the number of phases and how we balance that. So all those come together are incredibly interrelated, interconnected in a very complex web. So it took many, many planning sessions for us to come together and think through how best to address that. So there are, of that little middle exploratory diagram you see there in the middle, we probably had 15 versions of that by the time we got through all the planning process as we explored each individual topic and then how each topic interconnects with the other. This is the new schematic phasing plan that the advisory committee essentially came up with over the last year or so. In particular, the focus was between October and January this last year. There was an enormous effort to come up with this new plan, and it really, I'm amazingly proud of the work that the advisory committee has done. It really is a plan that addresses all their concerns internally within the Friendship Court community, but actually addresses a lot of the concerns that we heard from the surrounding community as well. It's an incredibly well-balanced plan overall, and I'll dive into details here shortly. But one of the things that it did is it reduced the total number of phases from 7 to 4. So as I said, phasing was an absolute requirement for us moving forward. And as we discovered, we actually looked at the idea of doing 3 phases and tried to assess whether that was feasible. And it turned out that if you do 3 phases, some of the other priorities start to erode. So how you do income mixing, how you do the right number of units in terms of townhomes versus multifamily buildings, that starts to all get compromised. So 4 phases ended up being the sweet spot. We also identified the Early Childhood Center as moving into phase 1. That's a benefit to the entire community early on. So even though only a certain portion of the residents will be moving into phase 1 at the beginning, if we can get the early childhood center established at the beginning, it benefits the entire community. And then more housing types. So in this diagram, the purple represents multifamily apartment style buildings, and the townhomes are in the red. And so you can see that there's a mix of both housing types throughout the plan. And if you pay particular attention, you'll notice that there's actually a mix of those housing types within each phase. One of the things I didn't describe as a core issue, but it became very relevant as we were going through discussing the phasing and planning process, is that the residents also wanted to be sure that there was open green space and play space for the kids in particular, not only overall, but within each phase in particular. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And then we rebalanced the future resident income mix. So instead of there being 600 units, as there was in 2016 proposed with 370 market rate, the agreement was that the advisory committee came up with was essentially a third. So a third replacement of the Section 8 units, a third 150 unit additional affordable units, and then a third market rate. And the reducing of the total number of units and the rebalancing of those actually dovetailed very nicely with the overall planning priorities in other parts of the plan. So the advisory committee worked very closely together with the design as part of the design team from October to January, and then through February and March, we went through a long series of community meetings to make sure that the plan that the advisory committee had come up with was consistent with the rest of the community's desires. And then, so we held these community meetings, and we had probably 25%, maybe 30% of the community come out to those meetings, and we felt like that was not good enough. So we had to then go door to door. And so Claudette and some other staff and some of the advisory committee members essentially went door to door throughout the rest of the 150 apartments, talking about the plan, talking about the phasing, and getting input. And the response was remarkably supportive of the direction that we're headed. And more than anything, I think the most common comment is, okay, so when do we get started? Folks were ready. As far as the timing goes, we plan on applying for low-income housing tax credits in early 2019. We'll go through, finalize that funding, go through construction, and have the first families moving in 2021. So you can see here in the phasing diagram that phase one, where you see right there, is actually all currently open green space on the site. So we were incredibly fortunate that we had that green space to work with as we were planning. If we did not have that, inevitably, probably we would have had to have chosen a plan that would have been considerably more disruptive and had to work with moving residents off-site temporarily to make that possible. But having that open green space to work with at the beginning is a godsend. So we get to build out phase one. As you can see in phase one there, move those 40 families that are identified there into phase one, and in the total of 106 apartments in phase one. So 40 families will be Section 8, and then we'll split up the rest between additional affordable and market rates. In phase two, we have 60 families to move into phase two once that gets built. And then you have 50 more families, the final 50 families moving into phase three. And you can see that in each of these phases, as I go through them, you have open green space and connectivity planned throughout. And that was a key part of what needed to be worked from the resident success perspective. Another piece from a planning perspective is that the roads that necessarily had to cut through the site, because as I mentioned before, it was built as a mega block, it needed to reconnect to the road network. But the residents wanted to also make sure that the people who were driving into the site were either coming home or coming to potential businesses on site. They weren't facilitating cut-through traffic. They had raised their children in a community where kids often walked into the parking lots and use that as almost as a secondary occupiable space. So they wanted to make sure that the pedestrians were still prioritized. So in this plan, you'll notice that the 4th Street, the north-south connection does connect all the way through, but has that intentional curvature and that serves a couple of different purposes. One is that it acts as a traffic slowing measure, and secondarily, it allows that future 1 acre park to be larger than it would have been otherwise if it were a straight line cut through. In that future park, we are in early discussion with the city about that being actually a true public park run and operated by the city. And then the east-west connection off of 2nd Street there to the west, it could have potentially cut through all the way to the site to either Belmont or Hinton Streets on the east side off of 6th Street. But again, the residents wanted to prioritize pedestrian connectivity over vehicular connectivity. So although that we needed that road connection on the west on 2nd Street, the connections at Hinton and Belmont Streets, which are just to the east into that single family neighborhood, those are going to be strong pedestrian and bike connections and prioritize that way as a form of connectivity, in part because Clark Elementary is a bit further to the east, maybe a quarter mile, and facilitating children and families being able to walk to school. Phase 4 in particular, you'll notice is a big blank box, and at the moment we haven't gotten to the point with the advisory committee of figuring out exactly how that's going to be detailed. The primary focus of the work was focused on phases 1 through 3, because those are the phases where everyone who's currently living in the community will be rehoused. As you can see here, by end of phase 3, everyone's rehoused. So when we get to phase 4, it's the quadrant of the site that is the closest to the commercial district, the downtown malls to the north and the other commercial uses on the west. So it will likely have a strong ground floor commercial retail component, but we have not fully thought that through yet, both residential above. So this is the plan as a whole. And in particular, as we look at phase 1, we're actually planning on submitting for site plan approval from the city. We're submitting at the end of this week, in fact, for phase 1. So this is a rendering that came out of the most recent set of design exercises, design charrettes with the advisory committee, looking specifically at phase 1 and figuring out how do we make sure we get not just the types of programs, the basketball courts, grilling areas, outdoor play spaces for children, how we get those components in there, but we went through a very explicit process at the beginning of thinking through this design process of not just identifying the things, but the qualities. And the one quality in particular stuck out more than any other, which was family time. And that lens is what led to and filtered all of the work that you see here in the phase 1 diagram. And like every planning process, particularly one where you have multiple phases like this, you need to be able to prioritize those spaces that are most important and recognize that there are going to be some spaces that won't make it into phase 1, but will come back in phase 2. So that was also one of the explicit processes we went through, is a prioritization process with the residents and the advisory committee, because there is obviously limited space in phase 1, and some of those conversations will have to come back in phases 2 and 3. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Claudette here to talk about lessons learned out of the process so far.
Yeah, so we've learned a lot through this resident-guided process, and the learning is a continuum. We learned that the election was a great way for residents to feel empowered. We learned that paying folks for their time was also, and their service was something that was really important, because we know that residents, just like anyone, it's taken their time and effort to do things. And so we wanted to tell them that we value their time and their service. And we learned that we had to be flexible and we have to listen to folks. As Sunshine mentioned, this has been a process that's it's evolved and it's continuing to evolve. And part of that is being flexible and listening to folks as they tell you what things are important to them. And we're always learning. And so we've learned always to learn, to educate folks, to help make informed decisions. And then lastly, we've learned to allow the residents to be the power of change. with that.
Yeah, thank you, Claudette. And I just want to strengthen that last point a little bit. I think in the last year in particular, we have worked really hard, maybe the last 2 points, to provide the residents the tools and capacity building so that they can really be the decision makers, and really have handed over the reins for this development process to them through this process. And although we meet only every 2 weeks, and of course there's detail work that needs to happen in between those periods, every decision point that we come to, the residents get to make that decision. And that is, I think, the core fundamental piece over the last year that has illustrates the success as we move forward. And with that, I think maybe we'll move into questions and go from there.
Thanks. This is Sarah. Thank you all again for presenting this webinar today. I know I really enjoyed tuning in, and one of my takeaways was that I think maybe is a lesson learned too in general is just to be open to change. And I like how you touched on how you weren't able to get in front of the residents initially as you wanted to, so you did your own grassroots outreach to make sure that they knew what was going on. And I just think that's so important in this day and age, just to be adaptable to change and new ideas. So thank you. I have a few questions coming in here. The first one is from Brandy Collins, and she wants to know, how much are the residents paid for participation, and what is the source of funding for those payments?
So the residents are paid $150 for each meeting that they attend. And the source of the funding is just a variety of grants and some internal funds.
Yeah, it's a mix. As far as the sources go, we continue to fundraise for that, both in the past and in the future. But as an organization, we've made a commitment that is critical. So even if we don't have the grant sources to cover that completely, which sometimes we don't, it still comes out of our reserves because we feel like that is absolutely critical to the process moving forward.
And just as a sort of bystander, I'm on the board of directors for Piedmont Housing Alliance, and full disclosure, but also these resident leaders are putting in a tremendous amount of their time. So making sure that they're valued for that considerable many years of work is important. And also, you know, there's food and childcare and other things that might prevent you from being at the table on occasion.
That's a good point. So each meeting that we do, we first of all make sure that it's at a location that is walkable from the community, so that we don't have any transportation issues. Secondarily, we make sure there's childcare on site, and usually those meetings happen during the dinner hour, so we provide dinner for those meetings as well.
Thank you. Next question, also from Brandy. What is the targeted AMI for the affordable and market rate units? Are there any ownership units in the mix?
All good questions. So AMI stands for area median income. So the question is, what level of affordability essentially are we targeting? So I'm going to go back a few slides here if I can. Maybe this will take too long. But the 150 existing Section 8 units, here we go. The 150 existing Section 8 units typically serve families at 30% AMI and below. And so that's families typically making maybe $20,000 a year or less. So the average median income at Friendship Court currently is around $14,000 a year, roughly speaking. And mostly single person household, head of households, and mostly single moms. The additional affordable units, we have not, that's a discussion we are still working with the advisory committee on, but generally speaking, they will be focused on families making between 40 and 60% of the area median income. So that means families who make typically between, say, $25,000 and $45,000 a year. And then the market rate units, again, we have not nailed that down explicitly yet, but generally speaking, we're not talking about building high-end luxury units for those market rate units. We're talking about building units for moderate income families. So probably in the realm of typically 80 to 120% AMI. And the AMI, the area median income in Charlottesville as a whole is around $89,000 a year this year. That changed pretty dramatically recently.
Thank you. Next question. Can you talk more about the funding? You mentioned LIHTC, but what other sources of funding are you all using?
So LIHTC stands for Low Income Housing Tax Credits, which is the vast majority of the affordable housing nationwide that gets built in this country is built using low income housing tax credits. I'm probably not going to get into the details of how that process works, but that typically should represent ideally 60% of the construction cost. That should subsidize 60% of the construction cost for each phase. But there is still a gap after that point. And every project probably has between 12 and 14 layers of funding. The next biggest piece will likely be directly from the city of Charlottesville. They are interested in stepping up to make sure that they want to maintain the affordable housing on site. They want to incentivize new affordable housing in the community. The Friendship Court community is very well known and very important to all the council members. So the city of Charlottesville will play a big role. Then there are probably a tier of 4 or 5 other sources of funding, everything from Federal Home Loan Bank to local foundations to potentially the Vibrant Communities Initiative, which is a partnership between VHDA and DHCD in Virginia. And then there'll be some private fundraising as well. So by the end of it, there will be probably 12 to 14 layers of funding for each phase.
Thank you. The next question comes from Paul Stoddard, and I think what it says, the swath and unit mix sounds like a win for project design. How did it impact project financing?
That's a good question. You know, as you can see in this slide, on the left-hand side in 2016, there was obviously the very high number of market rate units. Part of the assumption there was that that many market rate units was needed in part to help cross-subsidize the additional affordable. However, that assumption was also tied to a kind of a set of assumptions around the low-income housing tax credits. And without getting into too much detail, there are essentially 2 flavors of low-income housing tax credits. There's 4% and 9% tax credits. The 4% tax credits, just like 4 is a little bit less than half of 9, they provide a little bit less than half the subsidy of the 9% tax credits. And the planning process originally assumed 4% tax credits for majority of the phases. In reorganizing the number of phases and reorganizing the unit mix, when we lowered the number of market rate units, of course, that created less cross-subsidy, but it also opened up the opportunity for more subsidy from 9% tax credits, which is the path we're planning on moving forward.
Thank you. And just because we're approaching 1, I want to let the audience know we will go past 1. It's not a hard stop because there's about 4 or 5 questions left. So feel free to stay on. But if you need to hop off, feel free to hop off as well. The next question is from William Harris. What, if any, is the relationship between this project and PHAR?
So PHAR stands for FAR, which is the Public Housing Association of Residents. And it's for those who are in Charlottesville, it's a natural question because there is public housing, and maybe let me bring up this slide here for a second. It's not directly, you can't see any well, that's not true. So you can see public housing to some extent. So on the southwest corner, you see a slightly curved building right above where it says Key. That's Crescent Hall, which is a public housing building. And then there's additional public housing a block or 2 south of Friendship Court site as well. And FAR has been a strong advocate for public housing residents for well over a decade, for a long time.
20 years.
For 20 years. That's right. We have the 20th anniversary coming up here shortly. for 20 years, and they continue to maintain a very compelling conversation at the city level and keeping the city council accountable to keeping the public housing residents as a central focus in their planning. Friendship Court never has been, and it is currently not, public housing. It's privately owned Section 8 with Section 8 project-based vouchers. So even though it's easy to connect the two, they're actually independent from each other. That being said, FAR is an advocate not only for public housing residents, but also for affordability in general in the city. And we continue to work with FAR as best we can to figure out how to support each other and strengthen the affordable housing in the city as a whole.
Thank you. Next question from Tim Padalino. In the current or existing Friendship Court configuration, what is the ratio or number of townhouse units and multifamily units?
I'm going to bring up a different diagram here. This diagram shows all the existing buildings on site. Probably 75%, maybe 80% are in townhome configurations, two-story units. And then there are a few which are flat over flat stacked on each other, but they still almost occur like a townhome. So there's really almost zero existing multifamily apartment style buildings on site. They really are all effectively townhome configurations.
All right. Next question is from Nick Rogers. Meeting local zoning requirements for parking can be a considerable challenge for multi-phase projects like this, particularly for mission-driven developers. How have parking requirements been met for each phase and for the overall project?
My favorite question. Parking, no matter what you aspire to or how mission-driven you are, one of the first questions is always parking. How can you park it? And as the questioner pointed out, doing that in a multi-phase project is particularly challenging. So we have to think about not only how is parking addressed overall, but how are we addressing it phase by phase. One of the challenges of the 2016 plan, and let me see if I can bring that image up quickly, is that it called for entirely multifamily apartment style buildings. And you'll notice in this diagram, there's no surface parking. So it was all proposed to be structured parking. And back to the earlier question about financing and how that all came together, there is a lot of money associated with the parking that was necessary to make this plan happen. So part of our ability to reduce that amount of structured parking actually was one of the ways in which we eased the finances in the site as a whole. So when you look at the site now, you'll see along the red where the townhomes are, you'll see it's not delineated out, but those light gray little breakouts, which essentially are surface parking lots associated with each of the townhomes. We still have to have structured parking under the multifamily buildings. There just isn't the land area to allow us to be able to maintain the open and green space that we need on site and to do all surface parking. So it ended up being a balance. And to highlight that point further, there within a 10-minute walk, the only open space that exists currently on the site and for the community as a whole is that open green space that's there now. So we have to plan for a park in there. So we can't take that over with parking. It's just not feasible. So where we ended up was a balance of parking, some structured parking under the purple buildings, the multifamily buildings, and some surface parking. In general, we're aiming for a ratio of one parking spot per apartment. We did a survey, actually a pretty comprehensive parking study of the existing condition at Friendship Court, and determined that right now, with the 150 apartments, we need about 3/4 of a spot per apartment. So there are a number of families that just don't have vehicles. So aiming for 1 per apartment is the conservative track we're taking at this point.
Thank you. And then the last question, oh, just kidding, second to last question from Peter Stevenson. Will the name change to address the social stigma mentioned?
Excellent question. I don't know, Claudette, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, it's something that we have talked about, and we haven't made a decision as yet, but it seems like with a new redeveloped site, a name change would be appropriate. And that's something, of course, that we'll have to take the lead from the residents to see what their thoughts are.
Okay. And then now the last question from Paul Stoddard. Did the existing zoning allow for the planned mix of uses?
Generally, yes. One of our goals, as much as we could, was to try to figure out a plan also that was allowable under existing code without having to go through an SUP. It was going to be complicated enough as it was. But of course, there's another level of complexity, which is that the city of Charlottesville began a process of creating, basically imposing a new form-based code over its SIA, its strategic investment area, in which Friendship Court exists. They began the planning process for a form-based code, I guess a year and a half ago or something like that. They're actually doing outreach. The city is doing outreach right now to the community as a whole, and in particular the low wealth communities like Friendship Court and the public housing communities. But realistically, what's going to happen is that phase 1, since we are submitting for phase 1 under the current zoning, and we'll probably be that phase 1 will be approved under the current zoning before form-based code is finalized. But future phases 2, 3, and 4 will likely fall under form-based code, and we have been working with the consultants who are working with the city to make sure that the plan is consistent with that.
Okay. Thank you for answering all those questions, Sunshine. That was the last one. And I just want to thank all the attendees that stuck around. Again, be on the lookout for this follow-up newsletter. It'll have the CM information for the webinar, how to find the recording, and how to get in touch with the presenters and sign up for the October webinar. Thank you to Island Press and our presenters, Barbara, Sunshine, and Claudette. And I want to hand it over to Jen with Island Press for 1 second so she can give a little bit of info before we head out today.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for the presentation. It was excellent. I've learned a lot. Island Press is proud to take part and support this webinar. We're a 501c3 nonprofit book publisher, and we have a robust selection of books focused on sustainability in the built environment. Barbara Brown Wilson's one of our authors, and we, along with several thousand other authors, have books within Island Press. Her book, Resilience for All, has helped to elevate voices of change, shine a spotlight on critical issues, and focus attention on sustainability solutions. Please consider purchasing a copy of her book with the discount you'll find here just through our website at Island Press. If you'd like to discuss any additional partnership opportunities for your organization or a bulk purchase for your firm, feel free to reach out to me directly. Thank you so much, Sarah, for organizing this webinar, and to the APA community for your attention for this issue.
Yeah, thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your Monday.